Dr. Akintunde is the Director of Missions, Evangelism, and Discipleship at the Overseas Fellowship of Nigerian Christians and CEO of IOA Consults Limited. He's also involved in several Christian charities, as well as others working with persons with disabilities. He has won several awards for work within the community with international students and persons with disabilities. He is a public speaker, writer, and blogger who has contributed to discussions around disability, persecution of Christians, and faith in general. So we are going to pass over to Dr. Akintunde now. I give you the mic and I look forward to hearing what you have to say to us today. Thank you.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, because I recognize that you might be listening in various time zones and at various times. I would have said it's a pleasure to speak, but the subject I'm speaking on is one that is firstly dear to my heart, but secondly, does cause me a lot of grief as well. But it is indeed a privilege to speak on the impact of terrorism and all these activities on our education. But I really want to take education from a much broader perspective, because we all think about education as just our schools. But I think education is much more. It's what we learn as we interact with others in public, places like churches, mosques, and schools, etc. And those kinds of things that we learn tend to shape our lives and shape our futures. And I want to ask three questions because I know I don't have much time. The first question is, what access do we have to education, and what happens when we don't have those kinds of access? The second is, what are we actually being taught in those places? And the third question is, are we secure in our places of learning? So those are the three questions I wanted to look at in the short time that I have. Well, first question, what access do we have? Do you know, I was reading recently, and I was reading something that said that 13 years ago, there were 4 million children out of school in the Northwest and 3 million in the Northeast. That was 13 years ago. These are people who have not had access to the kind of education that we might call Western education. All right. Okay, cool. That's what access do they have? And when they don't have access, what do they become? Because they are 13 years now, they're adults. Without access to learning, without access to the kind of education that maybe people like us had, their prospects are limited. Their knowledge is limited, and they're more likely to be prey to people who do not have their interest at heart, who will drive them into places like violence, into places like killings, abductions. It's likely to create in them a psychological inferiority in any case that affects how they behave and how they interact. Do you know? And the lack of awareness is actually quite interesting, because the UNDP survey recently showed that many of these people who are fighting were not even aware that they were fighting against Nigeria itself as a country. They are actually a ready-made army of discontented people. So, what's my second question? Well, what do we learn? What have we been taught in schools? And there are two sides to this question. The other day, I heard some people speak, and one of them was saying that if there are 20%, if 20% of the population of any country, I'm not actually sure of the exact percentage, but perhaps 20 are Muslim, that they should fight for their lives for a Sharia state. I would have pointed out that that's not even up to 50%, but I didn't think it was worth the argument, because this person really did sound quite educated. So my question was, where was he learning this? He was educated enough to be engaging with me on Clubhouse, by the way. But where was he learning this kind of talk, that he should fight with his life if only 20% of the population of his country is Muslim? And what is that teaching him? What is it making him become? What is it making him do? How is it making him react? In a country where one of the most violent terrorist groups in the world is actually espousing an anti-Western education ideology. That's the first aspect of the question, but there is a second aspect of the question. it is that the Christian Association of Nigeria, I heard recently, had a meeting with the government and they were discussing the education curriculum. And apparently, part of the proposal that was coming out was a removal of Christian religious studies and history. When I heard that, I asked myself questions. Like, for example, the Germans still study their history. Do you know when they say those who do not study history repeat the same mistakes? If our country, if our government is actually thinking about removing history from our curriculum, is it surprising that 50 years after the Biafran War, we still find people talking about it and talking about it without a proper understanding of what happened or without a proper understanding of where it's taking us to? Now, I went to a school where I was taught, where I had the opportunity to learn Islamic religious studies and Christian religious studies. I chose to study Christian religious education, but I was aware that some of my friends were studying Islamic religious studies, and I respected them for it. If we have our opportunity to learn religious studies, we also have the opportunity to learn that those who do not agree with us have a right to live, have a right to their life. What are we being taught? It's a very important question. But the third question is, even those who get to school, are they secure? It was about 8 years ago that several girls were kidnapped in Chibok. And we all thought, wow, what a serious thing. The Bring Back Our Girls campaign was launched and all kinds of things. And we thought it would never happen again. But we were wrong. We're so wrong because it's still happening. The number of kidnappings in schools across several states was so great last year. And then I read a story in the Daily Trust in July last year. And that story said that the parents of children who were being kidnapped were being told, we are marrying your girls off. This is happening in a place where, as I said, 13 years ago, several million people had no access to education. If I don't have access to education and someone offers me education, would I go for it if I think I might be kidnapped? That's a question for parents to think about. But will they send their children to school in those situations? And again, my question is, what do they become? Do you know, the other day we read, of course, that Nigeria is number 7 among countries in the list of persecuted countries. The countries ahead of us are Afghanistan, North Korea, Somalia, Libya, Yemen, and Eritrea. All these countries are known for violence and for repression. It is not a company that I believe that the most populous, the most naturally endowed country, the country with one of the greatest potentials in Africa should belong. But that's where we are. And my question is, how did we get there? How can we get out? What are we teaching people about our lives, about our expectations, about where we want to be, about who we want to be, about the value we place on human lives, and about the safety of learning itself? Well, I think I've asked a lot more questions than I've given answers. But I hope that this being the beginning of the session, it gives us an opportunity to think through these issues in our minds, ask ourselves the questions, and as citizens and as government, take the right decisions. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to speak. God bless you all.